All right, so the meeting of the Ad hoc Revenue Source Task Force with the specialty of water rate study and review will come to order. We have the roll call.
Mayor Alan Galbraith, Vice Mayor Peter White,
Here.
Chair Jack Stewart,
Here.
Vice Chair Katie Leonardini, Committee Member Chuck Vondra,
Here.
and Committee Member Wayne Armstrong.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll ask for a motion to approve the minutes, or unless anyone has any corrections or additions to the minutes.
I move we approve the minutes.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
All right. Jennifer Toole and Steve Palmer have some background for this project.
So I wanted to welcome everyone here today. And so the initial slides are slides that you've already seen, but we thought we would just give a super quick background. And it's just reiterating some of the things that we talked about, and if there was any new members of the public that weren't here last time. But I do see some members of the public, but I do believe they were here last time too. So I'm going to make this very, very brief, and we're going to try to keep the meeting under 2 hours. So as we talked about last time, our water comes from 3 water sources, Bell Canyon, Stonebridge Wells, and the city of Napa. And I'm not going to go any further into most of this stuff. So the mission of the department, both water and wastewater treatment, is really to protect public health and the environment. And as you can see, it's a cyclical process from drawing water to treating water, distributing the water, to collecting the wastewater, and then treating it again, and then protecting the water source. So again, this slide shows the makeup of our water residents, and that we have approximately 2,700 connections, and that we're distributing about 550 million gallons of drinking water every year. And the bulk of our connections are residential. And just to remind you, when we talk about billing and units for the purposes of the rate study, anytime you see a unit, that is 100 cubic feet. So every unit that we bill in is 100 cubic feet, just to really complicate the mathematics.
And a cubic foot is 7.48 gallons.
Correct. So 100 cubic feet is 748.5 gallons. So if you can do that math in your head, I'm impressed. So as you can see from the last slide, even though about over 75% of the number of connections that we have are residential, only about 50% of the water is used by residential. And industrial make up for about 1% of the water connections, and they use about 21%. And then commercial utilizes about 17% of the water, and then other is the remaining. And so that was all water. Moving on to wastewater, we are full service. We collect, treat, and we discharge wastewater. We're averaging about 146 million gallons per year, and we have a permitted capacity of 500,000 gallons a day average. And you can see the bulk of our wastewater is residential. And in our system, we talked about this last time too, we have numerous assets, and most of it is very old. I think some of our newer infrastructure is about 30 years old, and we have miles of pipe, both water and wastewater, 6 storage tanks, 4 pump stations. And really the goal with any water or wastewater rates is to make sure that we're providing clean, safe water, but also meeting the state and federal regulations.
Okay, I'm going to take over this next 2 slides just to give you a recap of the net position for the funds. Hasn't changed from last time we met, but we just wanted to highlight it again so everyone can refresh their memories as to the current condition of the funds. So the water operating fund, I'm projecting to have an unrestricted net position at the end of this fiscal year, so June 30th of 2017, of just over $500,000, $525,000. What I wanted to highlight on this slide is that if you look at the revenues less expenses, it's negative $1,338,000. That's the red number. That means that this year we dipped into reserves to meet the operating expenses. So it's obviously not a good position to be in, to be having to use reserves to fund your annual operating expense. Reserves should be reserved for improvement projects or deferred maintenance or emergency type situations. And then the next slide shows the wastewater fund. And while it does show revenue and expenses essentially in balance, it also shows a net position at the end of this fiscal year, June 30th, that was negative $27,000. So even though this fiscal year we're balanced operating-wise, there were absolutely zero reserves. We actually had to borrow some money to make this fund whole. And so there's, for any kind of unaccounted, unforeseen emergencies or repairs that need to be made, we're not prepared, quite frankly. And then with the next slide, I think we'll go into the purpose of the rate study, and I'll let Jennifer Toole and Catherine take it back from me.
Is that about right? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, good. Okay, so again, Catherine Hansford from Hansford Economic Consulting, doing the rate study. So we talked on August 4th about the rate setting process, and I want to just recap that again today. The key thing is that rates are to be reviewed every 3 to 5 years. It's a continuous cycle to review where you're at with your fiscal positions in both wastewater and wastewater funds, and then go through this cycle of determining a revenue requirement. That's how much money needs to be raised from rates each year. Then selecting the rate structure that's most appropriate, calculating the rates, and then implementing them and reviewing again. So this continuous cycle of checking where you're at. Hopefully you're checking financially every year, but really considering if everyone's paying their fair share every 3 to 5 years too. So the two really key things about this cycle is calculating the revenue requirement. Again, that's the amount that needs to be raised through rates. It includes monies needed for operations, for maintenance, debt service, system rehabilitation, and capital improvements. So that is maintaining, keeping up your assets, prolonging the life of the assets. And the second key step is selecting the rate structure, and that's how to collect the necessary revenue requirement. That's done through base and use charges, or base and flow charges for wastewater. And what we want to try and do with this is to reflect local customer water and wastewater needs and demands on their systems. In doing this, we're trying to meet multiple objectives. So any time that you set rates, it's really a balance of meeting each of these objectives. So firstly, you want to make sure you have revenue sufficiency. You want to make sure that you have enough money coming in for all the things that you need to do, the everyday operations, and plus your system rehabilitation work. You want to meet what City has established as what they want to see as the level of service for both of those services, to support the operations, to further city policies and goals. But at the same time, if you're going to make changes to the rate structure, they need to be administratively feasible. And we need to make sure that they are simple and logical for the customers. People understand what they're being charged for and how they're using the system. Okay, I'm going to recap the goals. to adequately fund the water and wastewater systems, to operate the systems safely and provide clean, safe, and reliable water service, meet all regulations and environmental standards, federal, local, and state, to fund future system rehabilitation costs, provide timely maintenance extending the asset's useful lives as far as possible, to ensure that existing water sources remain viable in the long run, to build reserve so that you're able to fund emergencies and potentially changing regulatory requirements, to ensure equitable cost allocation and compliance with Proposition 218 and other legal requirements. Looking at St. Helena's rates, as you've just heard, the water fund is pulling from reserves for general operations. The wastewater fund has no reserves and a negative fund balance from the operations fund. In the last 5 years, rates have been adjusted by the Consumer Price Index annually. So since 2011, there's been an annual adjustment. But January 2016 was the last automatic rate increase. The city is not following best practices for reserve amounts for water and wastewater bonds. And both the water and wastewater funds have large capital improvement projects that need to be completed over the next 10 years. Looking at the water fund, this is the revenue requirement that's shown in the bars in bright blue. In 2017, that's this fiscal year, so this is fiscal year ending 2017, the revenue requirement is about $5.5 million. Currently, the city collects about $4.5 million in rates. So there is a deficiency for this fiscal year. That deficiency grows larger each year, assuming all of the capital improvements projects are carried out as they're scheduled to in the study. The revenue requirement will grow to over $8 million within the next 5 years. So that indicates some significant expenditures that need to be made for the system and that not enough money is being collected. On the wastewater side, it's a similar picture. Currently, I pressed it again. The city collects about $2.5 million in rates. The revenue requirement for this fiscal year is about $3 million, and that grows to just over $4.5 million in 5 years. To recap some major assumptions of both studies. Firstly, growth is conservative. The population is projected to increase at about 0.2% per year. That's 5 residential units being added each year. I think that's conservative because the U.S. Census reports that St. Helena added 75 units a year between 2010 and 2015. And we always want to err on the side of being conservative in these projections. The new rates are assumed to be in effect February 8th, 2017, and increase on November 8th, 2017, and each November 8th thereafter. The reason for those dates is that we want to increase the rates as soon as possible to increase the cash flow. However, just given the timing between the Proposition 218 process and City Council meetings and having an ordinance and when you're able to implement the rates, the February 8th, the end of that billing cycle would be the first billing cycle you're able to actually implement the rates. And then the November billing cycle was chosen because at the end of the summer period, that's when people have been paying the most. Then you go into the fall, water use starts to drop, and it's a easier transition time to increase the rates. And also, if you chose to implement a rate structure, which we're going to talk about with that seasonal rate structure, that would go through October. and then you would change the rates starting in November. So it's a good transition time that coincides with the seasonal rate structure too. Both the water and the wastewater financial models account for system rehabilitation costs. One of the reasons why the funds are in a poorer financial state right now is because there has not been a collection for system rehabilitation. And in effect, both systems have had to pull from whatever cash is available at the time to fund the projects that are needed. When we add system rehabilitation in, that allows, hopefully, for a more systematic approach to taking care of the assets. In the first 5 to 10 years in this model, all of the money that's collected for system rehabilitation goes directly to the capital improvement projects. But over time, by integrating that into the rate structure over time, you would gradually be able to start collecting to have a more systematic approach. And the rate structure is modified in both water and wastewater, and we're going to talk about those.
Catherine, before you go on to the next section, could you clarify for me the growth assumption, the difference between is this the assumption that there will be 5 units per year added in contrast to the U.S. Census having recorded 75 units per year, or was it 75 total?
No,
Between 2010 and 2015. That seems like a huge gap between 5 and 75. Can you explain that a little more? I don't quite understand.
Yeah, that was with discussion with staff. We talked about doing a no-growth scenario because that would be the most conservative scenario. And we talked about what kinds of development plans are in the works for the city in the next 5 years, what kind of applications there are. And it was just a general consensus between myself and staff that 5 units a year would be safe and that it's still a conservative number.
How is it conservative if it is the lower number rather than the higher number?
Because we don't want to rely on growth to bring in revenue to fund the system.
All right. I was thinking more volume of water.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I follow up on that question? 75 units per year? That seems wrong to me. That's suggesting that in 5 years we added 300 units to St. Helena. I would almost believe 75 units over the 5-year span.
I can pull out that table because I'm not positive right now. It does say 75 units per year, but I can check that. Should I take a pause and just do that? I'm happy to do that, yeah.
Right. Census, so unless we're
Units that we added was Magnolia Oaks.
yeah. And does this include business, new businesses, or is it all residents?
I think that's all residential.
That's just homes.
So that would be an average of 15 a year.
So I removed that. I removed the number of units from my table. I just have the population growth in there now. The average population growth was 0.2%. No, excuse me. The average annual population growth was 0.1% since 2000, but since 2010, it was higher than that. So that's how we arrived at the 5 units a year. It equates to 0.2% population growth because we divide it by the number of persons per unit.
And it's 5 units per year, not the 75 for the 5-year period.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Could you give that sorry, where does that census report come from, and how is it such at odds with the 0.2% projected number? I don't understand.
The census numbers are what's reported in the American Community Survey.
So those are fixed numbers. Those are hard numbers.
Yeah, from the census, yes.
So are we saying that the census is incorrect and it was really, instead of 75 units, it was 5 during that period? Or we're simply projecting that there will be fewer in the next 5 years than there were in the previous 5 years?
I will have to pull out my actual computer model, and I'm happy to do that if you want me to spend the time to do it.
We're not trying to put you on the spot, but it just seems like a huge discrepancy between the two
I'll pull it up.
results.
I would recommend, just in the interest of time, let's continue the meeting because this doesn't actually have an effect on any of the actual datas or the rates that we're about to see. And so we're happy to clarify the difference, excuse me, between the projected residential and the census. But however, I would recommend at this time that we just move beyond and that we can get you that corrected information or clarified information.
I think that's a good idea, but I think also we need to clear this up because the reliability and accuracy of the survey has an effect on the credibility of our recommendations going forward.
Absolutely.
Okay. Do the other members agree that we should proceed?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Catherine, and we'll await clarification on that question.
So I just wanted to also recap. This is the exact same slide that we had last time about the role of the task force. It was very important both to Catherine and staff that we give the public opportunities to have more information than just being presented the information at a city council meeting. And also we were seeking feedback on some of the, numerous, I think there's probably almost a dozen or half dozen items that we asked for input on. And so that's really the role of this task force, is to provide overall input on the methodology of the rate study and also to educate the rate task force and make sure it all makes sense before it goes to council.
So we're going to go into the water rate study. To recap how the bills are currently calculated for customers, bills are comprised of a base rate, or it's also called a service charge, and a use rate. So the base rate for water is dependent on the meter size of the service line, and then the use rate is charged according to how much water is actually used by that account. There's 2 billing tiers for water. There's a tier 1 and a tier 2 rate, and the dollar amount for each rate per 100 cubic feet is the same regardless of what customer type you are, but where that cutoff is or the block is for tier 1 and tier 2 is different depending on what type of customer you are. So here, for example, a single family account would pay the tier 1 rate for 0 to 14 units of water, and they would pay the tier 2 rate for any usage above that. For a multifamily account, they would pay the tier 1 rate for 0 to 5 units of water and the tier 2 rate for 6 units and greater. And the same thing applies for the non-residential customers, and that's their block is based on their meter size. We talked about this at the last meeting. We have some different water rate structure options to consider. The first one was a modified current rate structure. In essence, it's the same rate structure you have now, but it does eliminate the 2 tiers. So everybody would pay the same usage rate for all of their water. And the reasoning for that is that in the wake of what's called the San Juan Capistrano case, this is a legal ruling which had an interpretation of Proposition 218. And in that, or as a result of that interpretation, there needs to be shown a very clear demonstration between for what is an incremental cost of water. And for St. Helena, that's a very difficult thing to establish because you have 3 different water sources and you use all of them throughout the year. You don't have one source and then switch on another source when consumption reaches a certain level, for example. So trying to prove out an incremental cost of water is very difficult for your situation. The other structure is a seasonal rate structure. And again, customers would pay the base or service charge based on their meter size. And then they would pay seasonal use charges for their water. So it would be one rate for water in the off-peak months. Looking at the historical use of water here, the off-peak months would be November through April. And then a higher rate in the peak months, which would be May through October. We go back through the same action items that we discussed on August 4th. And some of these are just recaps, and some of them we're going to revisit and look for additional direction and decisions on. The first one was the standby rate. Currently, St. Helena's municipal code allows any customer to go on standby, which means that the water is completely turned off and the customer is charged $2.50 a month. They don't pay any other charges in that time period. So the base rate is not paid, and although there's no water use at the property, the water system, utility system, still requires revenues to operate. And what we're trying to do is to capture the fixed costs of the system in that base rate. So, in effect, what happens is that it's creating a customer subsidy. And as found by the courts, base rates are fees imposed whether or not the utility service is used. It is absolutely legal to continue to charge someone the base rate, even if they don't turn on their tap that month. And that was found in the Palan versus Brook Trails CSD 2013 case. They concluded that water and sewer base rates imposed on parcels with water or sewer connections, regardless of whether they are active or inactive, and regardless of whether or not the property owner uses the service, is a fee subject to Proposition 218. So what we heard from you at the August 4th meeting was that the general consensus was to update the municipal code and have all customers pay the base rate, eliminating the standby rate.
Sort of like renting a car. You pay a daily rate whether you drive it or not, but you pay a mileage rate for the wear and tear you put on the car.
That's a good analogy. Yeah. So unless we hear any differently, you'll see all of the slides from here onward do assume that all customers pay the base rate every month. Okay, the second action item that we had was regarding having surcharges in specific geographical areas. So the city does have several different geographical areas. Some of them are small, some of them are larger. And these areas might require a tank or a special pump station for delivery of water. And currently, only the Meadowood area is being charged a surcharge. The Meadowood area is outside of the city limits. And the surcharge is intended to cover the cost specific to the facilities that serve that area. So there are some other pumping stations in the city, but no other areas pay a surcharge, but the Meadowood area does. So we had presented this last time. The options for the rate study are to continue with a Meadowood surcharge, but updating that calculation so that the costs, so that customers pay for the actual costs of the system, or removing the Meadowwood surcharge and integrating the specific costs to that area amongst all customers, all water customers. A third option was presented in August, was to have surcharges for the other geographical areas. That would have been a very large endeavor to undertake, so we have not continued forward with that particular option.
So just to clarify, the options, option 1 is to continue charging the surcharge. Option 2 is to eliminate it and spread those costs out over all the residents.
Yeah.
Okay,
That's right.
thank you.
And that's for Meadowwood only.
What we heard was that you wanted more information.
Yeah. What I recall is the task force wanted actual numbers of how much it would cost, or what the cost increase would be for every single account if it was spread throughout all users. And we have that presented.
And this is Meadowwood Resort as well as the homes in that Meadowwood area. That it's not just the resort, it's also residents.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about 50 residences as well. And this chart shows the impact of discontinuing a Meadowwood area surcharge. So this is for a single family. It assumes a 5/8 inch account, and we picked a summer month. So a typical summer month usage is 17 units of water. So in November of 2017, if Meadowwood area surcharges continued, city customers would pay $160.70 in this scenario. If the Meadowwood surcharge went away, they would pay an additional $1.62 that month. So their total bill would increase to $162.32. And that additional amount that they would pay if the Meadowwood surcharge went away does increase, so it's just over $2 by the end of the 5-year time period.
I thought you said this was for a summer month?
Yeah, 17.
Are you,
100
so that's the 11th of August or November 8th in the date?
It's just that the dates are just with regards to what the rates would be in effect at that
Oh,
time.
I see.
So it's not particularly
All right.
relevant to the impact, but
Thank you.
good point.
So it's roughly 1% extra if we eliminated the Meadowwood surcharge.
Yes.
Is there anybody asking, is Meadowwood complaining? I mean, why are we even talking about eliminating a surcharge when we're losing money?
It was that it's part of your rate structure, so it was something that I examined as part of doing the rate study. We talked about different geographical areas. We talked about customers being inside the city and outside the city. That's kind of what I was tasked with looking at. We also were not sure how the current Meadowwood area surcharges are calculated. They have a rate structure right now, which is a little complicated. It depends partly on the pumping costs of the pumping station, and staff have to go through and calculate that each month. And so that's why we're bringing it up as, would you want to continue the surcharge or would you want to eliminate that surcharge?
What is the equity argument here? I mean, do you tilt, as our consultant, do you tilt one way or the other on equity in terms of?
Well, they're outside city customers,
cost?
so they don't have to necessarily be viewed quite the same way when we're thinking about the Proposition 218 process. As far as equity goes, no, I'm very neutral on that because this is really more of a policy decision than something that comes from the consultant. I would recommend changing the way that their surcharge is calculated and based on, and we've done that, but as far as whether you charge it or not, that's really a policy decision.
And Chairman, if I can jump in as our Public Works Director, there is an equity argument as to say a point of view is treat the whole system as a whole and not try and separate it into zones like this. And the fact that we're doing it for one specific area does raise that question. Is it really equitable to be treating that one area different than the whole system when it's a whole system that needs to be operated together and as a system? And so that's the question we came up with the consultant that we talked about.
Which is the same argument, part of the argument that we made for not having standby rates, because we're trying to maintain the entire system regardless of, or at least the basic costs of the system, regardless of whether you're there or not. Any other comments from the committee on that?
Well, if the rest of the city's rates would go up 1%, if we did eliminate the surcharge, out of the 50 homes, what percentage would their rates decrease? More than 1%, I would think.
The difficult part to answer that question is that their bills currently change each month depending on how much electric's used at the pumping station. So I can't peg off of a certain amount that they pay each month right now. I can look at what they would pay under the new methodology, which we have done for the rate study, and I could show you that change.
That's okay. Are we going to vote, or what's?
Can I ask one question? Is there significant administrative cost in administering the Meadowood surcharge?
Yes.
That would go away if we didn't have it.
Yes.
Is that relevant?
I'll let the city answer, but I believe the answer is yes.
Steve and I are both shaking our heads. There are significant costs. One of the items that Catherine has looked at is staff time related to pumping surcharges, particularly at Meadowood. And so we would need to much more carefully track staff costs, and that's not something that we're doing at a level that we would need to be doing. So currently staff is going out there multiple times a week to check on the pump station, to do readings, to do a multitude of tasks there. And that's just one small element of the proposed new pumping surcharge.
So I would elaborate on Chuck's question. From a procedural standpoint, what sort of action are you hoping this committee to take before 3 o'clock?
On this item in particular, or in general?
In general. Are we going through it piecemeal, or are we going to be giving direction once the report summary is finished?
I think the same way we did it last time, take it item by item, and then we'll summarize at the end was the intent of this meeting. And I believe there's additional information Catherine has on the Meadowood surcharge.
Yeah, I have another slide on it too.
Right.
So.
Chuck, are you okay with that procedure? All right.
Okay, so a little bit more information is that currently the Meadowood area surcharges collects about $55,000 a year. When we went through and looked at our best estimate of costs to actually serve that area, and again, it's best estimate because the city does not track that specifically. They don't have time cards that people are filling out, for example. So we looked at how many times they go out and service the pump station, what other checks they go out and do, and that's the maintenance cost a month. Then there's the electric cost per month for the pump station, which we added the costs. Then there's rehabilitation, because we really should be collecting for the costs for that to replace the pump at the pump station, and to, over the long term, replace the tanks as well. So there's a rehabilitation cost associated with that area. And there's also an interfund cost allocation, meaning that city managers' time, public works time, different functions of the city, they also spend time that gets allocated to the water fund, and that should also be allocated specifically to the Meadowood area as well. So that's all those different line items you see there, and it totals an annual cost of about $59,000 to $60,000 a year. So if the Meadowood surcharge was kept, this is the methodology on which I would recommend that the surcharges be changed to, and there would be an increase to Meadowood area customers. So in total, the amount would go from about $55,000 a year to $60,000 being collected from the Meadowood area. But as you saw, that was not a large impact to other customer rates.
Any questions? All right.
And if I could just add, it really is a policy decision. I mean, as your public works director, I had to say it is easier, and as Jennifer Toole is explaining, system administration-wise, it's easier for a city to manage systems that's treated as a whole rather than having these zones. So I mean, that's what we would lean towards as people have to operate in the system, because otherwise we're having to track time and timesheets, and tracking those costs on a daily basis can be challenging.
Now, did you say you wanted us to do this as they come up? All right.
Yes, please.
All right. So, gentlemen.
Well, it seems to me that the argument to eliminate the surcharge is that would save the city money, but yet the cost would get passed on to the residents. So I'm not quite sure how that all circles back. The residents don't benefit really, even though the city's saving money. And it seems to me that we're talking about $5,000 a year or so, that if we did eliminate the surcharge, that Meadowood would be saving, Meadowood residents would be saving $5,000 a year collectively.
No, so if the charges remain, it's about $60,000 under the new calculation that would be collected from that area. So that's $60,000 right now that you would credit against the revenue requirement. In other words, other customers don't have to make up that $60,000.
So the $1.62 was on a previous slide. The $1.62 for 2017, roughly 1% increase, was over. That was the present impact of the. No, that would be the impact of spreading it out over all ratepayers.
Correct.
So doesn't that mean we're taking that $59,000 and spreading it over everyone?
Yes, that additional $1.62 does that.
Okay.
And it seems to me rates are going up, so we're basing it on what's today, but when I look at the other graphs, at some point we have to raise rates, or we're going to run out of money. So if it's 1% of 200, that's different than 1% of 160.
This graph is future, so this assumes all the rate increase has taken place.
Oh, got it.
Because I couldn't do an accurate depiction of what people pay today. Because it changes from year to year depending on that pumping amount. But this graph looks at if the rate increases went ahead, how much additional would a single family customer in the city have to pay if the Meadowood surcharge went away, and that's $1.62 using the November 2017 rates.
Are there parts of the city that aren't being charged a surcharge that are, for whatever technical reason, more expensive to supply with water or more expensive to deal with the wastewater? Is Meadowood the only neighborhood in the city or near the city in the water service area that has extraordinary costs compared to, say, right next to the distribution point?
I didn't look at that specifically because, again, we would have to go to each of those areas, and I'd have to ask Steve to go ask his operators how much time do you spend out there every week? Are you adding, is there additional maintenance needs for that particular area? I'll let Steve
Are
continue
there
to
other parts
answer
of the
it.
city that simply are a higher elevation, like some
Right.
of the Meadowood?
Well, there are 2 other zones that are served by pumps. So, yeah, I mean, yeah.
So
there-
there's there's sort of
Yes.
a precedent here that even though it might be a little more expensive to deliver the water to a certain group of customers, we're already doing that in other parts of the city.
Yes.
So again, I'm sorry to belabor the point, but the 59,000 is the surcharge, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So would the city save $60,000 a year in staff costs if we did that, or more or less? Is that sort of the
No.
equation?
You wouldn't be saving, the city wouldn't be saving any money. It would, if this surcharge went away, the city would save a lot of administrative time that's
Which is
now-
money?
Right. We haven't analyzed to know what kind of money that means administratively. But in addition to Public Works just tracking time, it's also April. The finance director was reminding me it's also their time for billing and invoicing and utility billing and such.
So efficiency, staff efficiency,
yes.
organizational efficiency is an issue here.
Yeah, I would look at it as instead of staff tracking time, they'd actually be able to do something else with their time rather than just trying to put together all the background to be able to justify the rate. And then do we run the risk eventually under some of the new regulations that if we're not charging some of the areas but we're charging Meadowood, that we could be in violation of
218.
yeah.
This is a very gray area. A lot of 218, honestly, is has a lot of gray areas. And that's why we keep getting these different court cases and having different interpretations. I can just tell you from experience that some cities do have surcharges, or oftentimes on the wastewater side, they'll have a lift station charge in a certain area. But what happened with a recent client I worked with was they ended up with so many of these different lift station surcharges, and some of them were way higher than others because they only had about 12 residences for that particular pump. That in the last rate study, we went back to council and said, well, we need some direction. Do you want to continue doing this? It's becoming very burdensome administratively for the city. And you're ending up with these huge differences in surcharges in different pockets of the city when really at the end of the day, it's one system. Everybody's wastewater is going to the wastewater treatment plant. And that's why we say it's really a policy decision, because I don't believe there's any hard and fast rule on 218 about this. And it's really a question of do you view the system as a whole? I think you have a slight difference here because the Meadowood area is outside of the city limits.
I think personally, I would look to staff and the consultant to make a recommendation. I mean, it's not a lot of money. I mean, when I think of my own bill, $1, it's I'll just shower quicker or something like that. But I would say if staff feels that it makes sense to do it because it'll streamline workflow, then I think I would look for the staff and consultant to recommend what they think is right for the city. I don't think anyone's going to squawk about $1 a month, and my friends up at Meadowood owe me one.
Is there a pump for the houses above the lower reservoir?
Yes.
But they're not being charged a surcharge?
I'm not sure. I don't think so.
There's no other rates in your rate schedule or municipal code allowing for surcharges in any other areas.
I mean,
All right. Well,
before the last rate study, we were charging everybody that was outside the city limits, and then we found out that was not what we should be doing. It was a 20%,
Right.
I think, surcharge across the board.
And do we have a water district per se? Do we have something, or is the city limit the extent of an effective water district? Because one way to make the difference between Meadowood and the city different is to create a water district that includes everyone that uses the water.
Which is what we have right now, correct? I mean, our water enterprise is one system, whether we service outside the city limits or not.
Okay.
Right. And the difficulty between the inside and outside city charge was that we did not have records that would justify the 20% differential, which is why we gave up on it in 2011.
All right. Well, my inclination would be to eliminate the surcharge and charge everybody the same, as we seem to be trending. But Wayne, I haven't heard you give an opinion here. At some point, somebody needs to make a motion, and it won't be me.
Right, well, I would just like to say that our primary goal, to my way of thinking, is that we are trying to capture fixed costs as much as possible, while at the same time streamlining the system, as was already mentioned, in order to not be bogged down by, again, additional time and expense involved in these various surcharges. So while I feel that it is actually quite equitable to charge a surcharge when there is actual additional cost involved in bringing the service to the customer, I agree, given the fact that I'm seeing this 1% increase overall. I agree with Chuck that it's a small enough amount that I don't think anyone will have a real issue with it. I would be in favor of eliminating the surcharge for Meadowood specifically in order to make the system one system and, again, streamline it. Yes.
I still have one comment I'd like to make, is my only concern would be, are we setting a precedent? Let's say another user decides they want to join into the system and they're out of the city limit and it truly is an exorbitant cost. They can say, wait a minute, you let Meadowood off the hook, we demand to be treated the same, and now we've really dug ourselves in a hole. So are we creating a precedent that might handicap our options to some future user? That would be a concern.
I think the answer to that is likely no, because we don't allow new connections outside city limits.
Okay. That is a policy. Okay, well then, given that, I will move that we
All you need to do is
eliminate.
second,
Oh, you already
because
moved?
we have a motion on the floor.
Yes, indeed.
I second.
Let's just for the record, let's vote on that. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. And I think we have to go back to standby rate too. Don't we have to act on that?
I don't know that they made a motion last time.
We kept it very informal. We didn't do formal motions and seconds last time, so it was really just more of a conversation and
Informative.
staff
Okay.
taking the information.
All right.
So I don't believe we need to do motions and seconds. I think just
All right.
general consensus
Do it by
that there's an
acclamation.
understanding of the task force is all we need for these purposes. If you
But-
would like to go back and
Well, we
make a
don't have
motion.
to do it in the form of a motion, but I don't think, although we may have all nodded our heads, I don't think we specifically said we agreed that eliminating the standby rate was a good idea.
Yeah.
Should we at least get that
But
on
we
the
had that
record?
conversation last meeting, and everyone agreed unanimously last
But now
meeting.
you're tricking me because that was August 4th.
Well, they did ask if anyone had any change in thought, and nobody piped up, so to speak.
So we still agree.
Yeah.
All right, good.
Okay. All right, so let's move
Start taking my
on.
showers up at Meadowood now.
Just bear in mind that all the numbers and the graphs that you see today in this presentation, they're assuming what we did was we kind of built on each action and we assume one of the actions as we move forward. So the numbers will change from what you see today to what you see in the written up report. Okay, so our next action was talking about the functional cost allocation. And this is determining the amount of the revenue requirement that gets collected in the base or service charge and how much of it gets collected in the use rates. Currently, 30% of your water revenue comes from the base rate and 70% comes from use charges. In the water rate study, we functionalized the costs of the system. And a result of that analysis was that you have about a 70% fixed cost system. So it's flip-flopped, and you have about a 30% that's variable. There was a very strong train of thought back in 2011 when you did your last rate study, and this was very much advocated by the California Urban Water Conservation Council, that it would be a best management practice for agencies to collect, as it happens, the 70% of water revenue from use charges and 30% from base charges, and that's what your rate consultant recommended. That was very much the school of thought at the time, regardless of what your actual functional cost allocation analysis demonstrated. Well, what's been really learned over the last 5 years, in particular with having the drought and mandated conservation, is that the pricing model does not have as much of an impact as water conservation initiatives themselves. Rebate programs, heavily promoted education, state-mandated elements to the conservation program. And so there's a couple of things happened. One was that those agencies that relied heavily on use charges suffered decline in revenues. So that was one difficult consequence. And another is that it didn't necessarily, a lot of agencies felt like they should be reflecting in their structure how much it really costs to run the system, regardless of whether people actually use water or not. So right now there's a little bit of a war between the mindset of, well, we have water meters for a reason. We want people to conserve. We want people to pay for what they actually use. And a mindset of, yes, but we really need to recover our fixed costs, and we need to be able to run the system without dipping into other city funds when necessary. So what I would recommend is that you gradually move more toward having a rate structure that reflects your cost structure. But I wouldn't recommend going all the way to a 70% in your fixed rates, because A, you're going to have a fairly substantial rate increase. B, those people who are on fixed incomes or who are on lower incomes will be impacted at much greater amount than those with higher incomes. So we talked about at the last meeting, you could look at going to a 50-50 cost split. You could you could do this gradual increase. And you had said at that meeting that you wanted to see what that meant before you could make any kind of action or decision. So here I'm just recapping those different options. And here are the results. So on the left-hand side, again, we're using a 5/8" single-family customer using 1,700 cubic feet, so that's typical use in the summertime. If we keep the 30-70 split, they would pay $46.45 in the base charge and $115.11 in the use charge. If you went all the way to a 50-50 split, it would be $70.90 in the base charge and $82 in use charges. So there you can see that large impact for people on lower incomes, fixed incomes. If you did a gradual increase to the base, in the first year, when we say gradual, we mean about a 1% shift each year. It's very gradual. Then that's that middle column. The customer would pay $48.88 in the base charge and $111.82 in the use charge. So the shift is very small compared with that 50-50 change. Now, this split will affect different customers differently as well. So we wanted to look at some other customer categories, not just single family.
Before you go to the next one, could I ask a question?
Yes.
On the gradual base, what length of time are you spreading that over, and to what goal?
So it would be 1% added to the base each year. So it goes from 30, 31, 32, 33.
1%?
The model, yes, just 1%. The model goes out 10 years, but the city council, you can vote to change rates for 10 years, but I would not recommend that. I would recommend only going out 5 years. Obviously, the further out we're doing modeling, the less certain we are of those projections. So a typical time frame to adopt new rates would be 5 years.
This seems to be an immediate need. So 1%, doesn't that take 100 years to get to?
Well, to get to
30 to 50 is we're only needing to get 20%, so
Okay, you're talking you're not talking
Increment.
about a percentage of the rate, but a percentage of the
increase, or the
increase,
shift.
The shift, yeah.
So it'd be 31%, 69% the next year, 32, 68, et cetera. So when I'm looking at this graph here, the $152, is that assuming a 1% shift, or is that already getting me to the 50/50?
That's going straight to the 50/50.
Okay, even though we wouldn't do that, that's what it would, in 20 years, that's what my bill would be.
So this just takes the November 2017 calculated rates, and it says if we collected half of the amount that we need in the base rate and half of it in the use rate, your bill would be $152.90. It's different for every customer. You'd asked me to look going straight to a 50/50 split. But what I really want to point out here is you're going to be going from, so currently a 5/8 inch single family customer pays $27.62 a month. I might be a little off on that. Close, I know. Let me just check. But it's about it's about $27 in the base amount each month. So this rate increase, they're looking at, it's going to go to $46.45 if you kept your current split. If you went straight to a 50/50, customer would go from paying $27 a month in the base charge to $70 a month in the base charge. And that's just an enormous impact for people who are on lower or fixed incomes.
And I have seen some people on lower fixed incomes only use between 1 to 3 units of water a month. So it is pretty significant.
So I want to show you some other impacts. Okay. This is for a 1-inch customer. Again, fairly small change as you'd expect with the gradual increase, but a much larger change if you went straight to 50/50. And I think we have but a huge impact for a multifamily 1.5 inch because this is affecting the base charge. The base charge depends on your meter size. The larger the meter size, the greater the base charge is. And so and the larger the impact of changing this split as well. So if you look at a 1.5 inch account here, you can see that it's a very significant impact if you went straight to a 50/50 split.
Can we get an example of a multifamily? I'm trying to picture a typical multifamily. Are they getting one bill? Do they get each unit gets a bill, or how does that work?
They get one bill. It's based on their meter size, and then how much water goes through the meter, and then they have to split that up between their apartments.
So let's use an example. Hunts Grove, would that be an example of a multifamily? And there's 59 units there or so, or 80? So the entire Hunts Grove pays $300, or is that per unit would be paying the $300 per?
That's the entire. I don't know how many units are on this particular example, though.
But it's down to 700 cubic feet
That's correct.
instead of the 17.
Yes, because it's each multifamily unit only uses about 7. Oh, so that is on a unit. That's on a unit basis. That one was calculated.
So if I am a resident at Hunts Grove, today I'm spending about, under the new rate plan, I'd be spending about $195 a month.
Yes.
And why would they be paying more than a single family? Well, not more.
That doesn't seem possible.
That doesn't
It's
seem
an
fair.
affordable
An apartment's going to
housing.
use a lot less water than a house with no landscaping. So I mean, the first two examples are insignificant enough to where I don't see a problem, but when I see basically a 50% jump, I'm concerned a little bit, but I can't equate, is the 300 per apartment, is it, if Hunts Grove in its entirety is paying $300 a month, divided by 80 units, that's not that much.
Okay, I need to take back one thing I said there. So the 700 cubic feet, that is for the account for summertime usage. So we were looking at a single family home using 1,700 cubic feet in the summertime. This complex is using 700 cubic feet. It is the entire complex. I don't know how many units are on this particular account.
So the single-family example would have presumably more landscape irrigation? Because
Yes.
it's one unit and it might be a quarter acre
Mhm.
or even a half acre with garden and lawn and
Yes,
so
the
forth.
single-family unit averages 700 cubic feet in the winter months and 1,700 cubic feet in the summer months.
And are you,
Unless I'm reading it wrong, if I'm reading that, and again, the other thing is this is over 20 years, so when we see this $303, that would not be, that would be if we jump there right now.
Correct.
The proposal is to do it a little bit, but nevertheless, in 2037, that unit would be paying $303 a month, whereas if we didn't do it, they'd be paying $195.
If you kept that 50-50 throughout.
Yeah. Well, my gut reaction is we're not really making any more money. We're just shifting it and protecting ourselves, but we are creating a burden on lower income people, as I see it. So unless I'm missing something, I don't see a huge benefit in. And I did see it 2-3 weeks ago, but I didn't see the impact. That's why we'd asked for impact.
well, I'm sorry, I'm still confused here. It seems counterintuitive that someone in an apartment in a low-income housing project
Today,
today would be paying more or about the same.
Maybe
This is
I
the
can help.
Please do.
Yeah, I'm just going to try. So what Catherine's done here is the calculation for multifamily is based per service, and it's inch and a half service. And like she was explaining, it's more than one unit. So it's not per that $195 or $303, whichever year you're looking at. It's not per unit. It's per service account that we have at the city. And we don't know, I guess that's the clarification we need to provide is how many units are in this example on a
Correct.
1.5 inch service. How many units would that be? I mean, my guess at inch and a half service, it might be like 6 or 8. I'm thinking something like that.
Hunts Grove, using that as a
Using that, I'm just using not using Hunts Grove because I don't actually know how big their service is, to be honest, or how many units are there. It sounds like it's about 80, but for inch and a half service, you'd probably get 6 to 8 customers on it. I mean,
So then,
with no landscaping.
and they'd be
So then
dividing
the-
the 195.
They'd be dividing that up.
so then the
Right.
base rate would be divided up if we were assuming that each unit would use 700 cubic feet a month, or each one of those might be using 100 cubic feet a month
Well,
or
and this is
something.
where it gets even more complicated.
Yeah.
We don't know how each individual multifamily service divides up their bills. So one may have a manager on site that maybe they don't have to pay for their water and the rest of the units do. So we can give you the total cost of what a multifamily would be, but actual impact on, say, they have four units on that inch and a half line. We don't know how the management distributes the bills.
Would a Stonebridge or Hunts Grove have more than 1 meter for the entire development? Or would they only have 1 meter?
Jen says they have more than 1 meter.
Yeah, I mean, Stonebridge is on irrigation water, so they don't use treated water for irrigation. They use water that's coming from the well that's on the left-hand side of the Pope Street just before the bridge, I believe. So they've got a separate meter for that.
Yes, I'm sorry, I don't know which particular account this is, and we couldn't tell you anyway because of customer confidentiality. But that's the crux of it, is that you would, most likely, that management company would divide that total bill by each unit and charge it in their rent.
Let's use another example, Vineyard Valley. Do they have each unit there has its own?
No,
No.
no, they have two meters.
I mean, again, I don't want to be painstaking, but what would be helpful to me is to take an example like someone living in Vineyard Valley or someone living in Hunts Grove and saying that apartment rates, how would it affect that person? If it's negligible, then I think this is a good idea. If it's very significant, I don't think it's a good idea, and I don't know that I can figure that out based upon these models here.
And
And
it's
I
difficult for
don't
us to,
Think
I'm
you
sorry.
can't- I'm sorry. No, sorry, you have the.
just to amplify that, it's difficult for us to weigh the burden, the extra burden on low-income people if we don't know whether we're talking about 4 apartments, 1 family unit, 7 family units, 80 family units. So it's tough to,
I don't know that we're ever going to get to that.
Well, I mean, we
but we
could.
could get closer.
To me, if you get, I think it wouldn't be that difficult to take, say, 3 examples. Take a Vineyard Valley, take Hunts Grove, and take a 5-plex or something like that and say, as an example for each of those size situations, per user, this is the impact under the 30/70 and under the 50/50, and then it would allow us to sort of picture someone living in those and what kind of impact they would have.
Yeah, unless there's a policy of that property owner that they're going to spread it over 2 units or, just like, I mean, it's really going to be different for every different private ownership of multi.
We'd be a lab for you. 210 units, and we would be glad to share it. It would help you. I mean, is that a reasonable concern that I have, or am I being
I think
picky?
it's reasonable,
Yeah.
and if,
Oh, I think it's very reasonable, but
and if Vineyard Valley management can provide that, that would be helpful.
Is there an option to go with this concept for the 1-inch pipe and not for the 1.5? That way, it's either all or nothing.
All in or all out, huh?
All right.
Yeah.
Well, then I guess my point is I'm unable to make a decision because I can't really understand the impact on that level, only in the multifamily environment. In the other 2 scenarios, I think it's negligible. For me personally, I save money, but that's my position right now.
Well, and I just want to interject that this is exactly why we wanted to take these items before the task force, but also to let you know that we would not be bringing this again before the task force, that this is the last meeting. So anything that you have questions on would then be presented to City Council. And I just want to clarify that.
No, I was going to say, even if we were able to know the number of units that was in this one example scenario, whether we knew specifically who it was or where it was, that would be helpful, because one could make an educated guess that barring a management apartment, you could just simply divide this $303 by 8 units and get a fairly close approximation of what the multi-unit per person, if you would, or per apartment fee would be. So I do think that would be helpful.
Okay. Can
But
I
I realize
make
it's-
one more comment? I think really what we were trying to get to with these graphs is more just the impact, the difference. It's not about, we weren't trying to draw attention as to how much your bill would actually be. We were really just trying to draw attention to the fact that if you go straight to a 50-50 split, it's going to be a much larger impact for those who, whether they're in a rental apartment, assuming that cost gets passed on evenly, or whether they're in a single-family home, it's a very large, sudden adjustment to make. So people's bills, they will notice that rapidly. If they're using 500 cubic feet in a month, and suddenly their base charge has gone from $27 to, just go back here a moment, $27 to $70, there's going to be a lot of conversation about that. And so that's really what I was trying to point out with these graphs. Not so much about the bill amount, but about what impact this has on customers.
To me, like this is our one chance to weigh in, that we're not going to weigh in again. And my thought would be based upon the fact that I can't anticipate the impact, number one. And number two, this change, while it's fair, it does de-incentivize people to conserve water. If I had to vote right now, I would say leave it as is based upon the knowledge I have at my disposal. Again, another bad pun, the water realm, but that would be my thinking.
Well, I think we have to balance the obvious and reasonable concern about somebody's bill going up enormously, more than doubling or even tripling with one change, with the immediate need we have to get more money into the enterprise. So I hate seeing, I won't say hate, I'm concerned with the increase only being 1% a year. I don't think we'll ever get to the goal. The costs will rise faster than our increases, it seems to me, at that rate. So my suggestion would be to, seriously consider sort of the threshold, the threshold between covering our costs and starting to impact people unfairly, because we've got those two forces pushing in opposite directions. And the other thing that I think we talked about briefly, at least last time, was the reason for the different rates for the different pipe or meter diameters. It wasn't conclusively demonstrated that those had any difference in city cost and didn't relate to how much water you actually used. So why should there be a difference between 3/4, 1 inch, and an inch and a half, unless I'm missing something obvious, which I sometimes do.
I can respond to that. The meter size, charging the base use on the meter size is to capture the capacity. So how much of the capacity of the system does that particular service use, could it use potentially? So that's why the difference in the meter ratios between between the different meter sizes, the cost for each size, is that it's based on the amount of flow of water that you can get through that meter. It's maximum continuous flow rate. And because you can get more water through a 2-inch meter size than a 5/8 inch, the base rate is intended to reflect that, because we're looking at capacity. Again, we're trying to capture those fixed costs of the system. It's not necessarily how much one individual customer uses, but how much they could use. On the other hand, the use charge is truly reflecting how much water goes through the meter.
So is the history of the meter size random and illogical, or were these meter sizes approved for different uses?
Yeah, these are approved. They are American Water Works Association standard meters, meter ratios. And we did go through this quite extensively with the city. We made sure that we had the flow rate of the type of meters that the city uses. And we went to, there's an M6 manual for AWWA, and that's where we get our numbers from.
But what I'm trying to get at is, are there residential single-family meters that are 1 inch or 1.5 inches?
Well, I'm sorry if I can interrupt. I think, we're skipping ahead to the base fee discussion, which is the next part of the presentation. I think we're getting a little bit off. I think we should
Cost allocation as well.
finish up functional cost allocation. Yeah, the questioning is starting to get towards the next kind of slide. So
I've got one question that I asked the last time that we had a rate increase was, by keeping this 30-70 split or even going to a gradual base increase, are we ever going to be able to reconcile the lower usage of water to the revenues that we need to seek? We didn't get there in the last 5 years, so I'm curious as to whether this will really get us there over the next 5 years if we do the gradual increase.
Well, In the model, yes, a large part of that is based on how you project water use per service in the rate model. And we looked at the historical use, and we looked at how much was used in the drought, and we went off of the last year's water use. So the hope would be that, again, we're trying to be as conservative as possible in the model so that you don't end up in that situation where you're not getting enough revenues. So we've done the best modeling that we can think of at this time.
So in essence, we're almost doubling the base rate anyway, and charging more for the water
Yes.
in the hopes that everybody is going to use the same amount that they've been using with conserving.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I think you're going to see more people conserving. I drive around, more and more people are ripping out lawns and putting in less thirsty stuff. So, and they're buying more efficient washers. So I think you're going to continue to see, and that's a good thing.
That's why I keep bringing up
Yeah.
that question: is this going to cause more conservation
You mean
by raising the rates, and people going to cut back even further? So we still have that deficit.
I'll just interject. The model does account for that. It's called price elasticity. So we anticipate that when water prices increase, let's say 10%, that customers will decrease their use by 1%. Now, each customer category has a different percentage or price elasticity. So that is taken into account in the model.
Okay.
And there's other options. Maybe you go 1% and stop at 40-60. So it doesn't have to be as presented here. There might be other options to kind of move the dial a little bit, but not create a difficult situation for a certain sector of the population. So it sounds to me like this is going to be a city council decision if we don't vote on anything or make a recommendation. I guess I'm just pointing out there's other ways you could slice it up to address the issue without being all the way 50-50 or 70-30 or whatever.
All right, let's carry on. We have another 18 pages of the
Yes.
PowerPoint, so sorry about the delay.
Okay. So the next topic was the residential customer base fee. Currently, all 1-inch customers pay a greater base rate charge than the 5/8-inch customers for the reason we already discussed. However, to meet California Residential Code, Section R313, many of the new homes are now required to be equipped with 1-inch meters. The issue is that the actual water use of the home is no different from a home with a 5/8-inch meter, and there's been arguments that really those 1-inch single-family customers should pay the same base charge as a 5/8-inch customer. So we wanted to present to you what the difference would be if they paid the same. Okay, so the options here was 1-inch metered residential customers pay the same, or continue to pay more per month in the service charge, or the 1-inch and the 5/8-inch single family residential only pay the same base charge. Okay, so here in this graph, on the left we have a 5/8-inch customer, and in this scenario, the 1-inch single family customers pay the 1-inch fees, the 5/8-inch customers pay the 5/8-inch fees. Total bill is $163.68. In the middle is the bill that would be paid by single-family 1-inch and 5/8-inch meters if they paid the same. So it goes up a little bit for the 5/8-inch meters. On the right is a 1-inch single-family customer, and there, under that scenario, they pay that is today's scenario. They pay the 1-inch customer base charge. So if you kept things status quo, the 5/8-inch customer would pay $163.68. The 1-inch single-family customer would pay $204.80. If they paid the same, they would pay, both of those would pay $166.02 a month. And I think that's what you were looking for when we presented this option last time. Was you said we can't really make any decision without seeing the numbers.
So in this case, we're arguing on the opposite side of the previous argument, meaning it's not about capacity, it's about use. It's about how much water residents will use regardless of meter
That's true.
diameter.
That's true.
It's a dilemma.
It is a dilemma, and it's a dilemma with every single water rate study I do. There is no, again, it comes down to this policy decision, because you do the functional analysis, you see how much your fixed costs are, but do you want to charge people more based on what they're actually using, or do you want to charge them, do you want the majority of the cost to be based on how much they could use?
And how much they could use would be only if they would only use how much they could use if they had a 5-inch hose on their meter or a 1-inch hose on their meter and left it on all the time, and then
Correct.
there'd be
Yes.
more water in one yard than the other.
Yes.
But in practice, that doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
What's the proportion of 1-inch versus?
It's about 20% of the single-family customers are 1-inch.
Is it-
you-
Is it based on square footage of a house, or what are they?
No, well, I think it's just historical, right? Almost all single-family houses were
It's
5/8
it's strictly based on whether or not they've upgraded recently, had they put in fire sprinklers, and then when they did their fire sprinkler calculations, if there's enough pressure and flow in the street to get them the pressure and the flow they need to provide adequate fire service. So there's no way to predict, really. It's case by case.
Okay.
Any
I-
thoughts here?
Well, my thought is don't penalize someone because they could use more. That would be my initial logical thinking. Just because you can doesn't mean you will. And if you will, maybe it's only because you had a fire and you already got problems if you got a fire. So I would, unless I can be talked out of it by my colleagues, I would vote to level it out for the 5/8 and the 1-inchers.
Wayne?
Well, I feel that recovering fixed costs is thematic of many of the conversations we've had, including other conversations in the context of the task force regarding other city fees. And so I'm very concerned with the obvious issue of finding revenue that is required to not only meet our current demands, but future as well. So on face value, I have to agree, I cannot understand this huge premium for the meter size, 1-inch versus 5/8. So I would agree with you generally that it makes sense to have everyone go in the middle. I just would like to go on record as saying that I think that if I could offer one piece of editorial in this sort of last meeting, it would be that I think that whether it's 1% of the gradual increase, going backwards to the previous slides, or some slightly higher one, the goal really should be to look at getting as close to capturing those costs as we can. We cannot continue down the path that we've been doing. Our fiscal situation shows us that. So I think this is something of an anomaly. I kind of like that there's $60 a month here that sort of is happening, but logically I don't think that it makes sense. So again, beating the horse bloody dead, I think I would go in the middle here. But I want to just focus that we need to keep pushing forward as much as we can to close the gap.
So my understanding is that the staff is already figuring out what that rate needs to be to make us, so we're not really talking about revenue here. We're just talking about percentage. Are we spreading it out, or are we how we apportion it. So these decisions don't impact revenue as I see it. It impacts individual cost, but to the city, it's the same.
Correct.
That's the way I view it. So, so,
I was looking more at the 1%.
but even that isn't gonna change revenue. It's just gonna shift.
It needs to be more than 1%, is my opinion. And I'm understanding that the 48.88 and the 51.21 and the 90 are the present rates. Is that true?
No, this would be under the increased rates.
Okay.
So these are the increased rates I just referred to. So when we look at the shortfall that's been projected, staff has already said these need to be the rates to balance that out and provide for rehabilitation. So that's already baked into these.
Correct.
So they've already done that. They've already figured out what we need to charge.
Yes.
We're just deciding, are we gonna level the playing field, and how do we apportion that? So we're not driving revenue.
Got it.
We're driving apportionment, so that makes it a little easier.
I appreciate that. Thank you. That helps.
All right, I guess I'm having a bad day because I keep getting confused. So is this the 30-70 or is this the 50-50 in terms of what's being?
This assumes
is
the
this simply-
gradual increase option. We've also assumed in this one that Meadowwood area is continuing to pay a surcharge. We had to make some assumptions with these different action items to show you the results. That's why I said the numbers that you see today will probably be different from the numbers in the draft report, because based on what I hear from you today, I have to draft the report for council. So
All right, well, my opinion is if as in this case, the water is being used for the same purpose and in the same volume, that the base rate should be the same. But I also think the base rate should be increased as high as possible without causing undue hardship. Thank you.
Well, it's almost doubling already, so.
But, you know, I think as we talked about last time, water has been too cheap in California for too long, and we really have to get real about covering our costs.
And that we're generally in the sort of middle, lower range of other comparable Bay Area cities.
you're going to see that. We're going to get to that. So,
I'll be quiet.
All right, carry on, Catherine.
okay. So I think I heard a consensus here today to move forward with a single-family 1-inch meter paying the same base charge as a 5/8-inch single-family.
Yep.
Yes, thank you. Okay, let's go to the next one. The next one was an option regarding drought surcharges. So during a drought, additional water conservation leads to a decline in revenue, and the cost to deliver each unit of water increases. A drought surcharge would help offset the revenue loss during drought periods and the increased cost per unit of water. To do this, drought criteria would have to be established, clearly defined, and adopted in city's municipal code. Okay, so the options are to implement a drought surcharge, which is the consensus of what we heard last time, but conditioned with, but you wanted to see what that impact was. The other option was do not implement a drought surcharge. Okay, so a little bit of background on this. Looking at water use in a drought year versus in a non-drought year. So note here we have calendar year 2013 as a non-drought year, and we have 2015 as a drought year. You can see there the total volume of water decreases from 601 billion gallons to, I'm not used to billions, it's usually millions, to 500 and almost 2 billion gallons. So
It's millions.
601
it's 600 million, but I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh yeah, it has 6 zeros.
million. I was gonna
Thank
say
you.
600 billion, that's,
Right, so 502 million, thank you, million gallons, yes. Okay, in a non-drought year, surface water, that's water from Bell Canyon, makes up about 40% of the total supply. The Napa water, about 32%, and groundwater, 28%. In a drought year, that shifts. So surface water makes up about 46%, Napa water about 38%, and groundwater about 16%. So the big change that you see there is that in a drought year, the amount of groundwater as the pie decreases. Trying to conserve your groundwater supplies. So if we're looking at what a drought surcharge should be based on, we did a calculation to see how much it costs per unit of water, and we did that by weighting the cost for each unit of water on the source of supply. So in a drought year, so the cost of imported water from City of Napa, when it's weighted, so the cost is $6.70 per 100 cubic feet. But when it's weighted, because 38% of the water comes from Napa, that's $2.53. So if we look over on the right-hand side column, what we're really looking for here is the total cost. Oh, it was in thousands of gallons, but when we go, that's in thousands of gallons there. So in a drought year, the cost per unit of water is $3.94, and in a non-drought year, it's $3.43. We have to add to that other costs associated with operating the systems. So we end up with a total cost of $9.62 in a drought year and $9.10 in a non-drought year, and that is per 100 cubic feet of water. So what it says is that the cost to produce water is 6% higher per unit of water in a drought year than in a non-drought year. So the way this would work would be that you would have a 6% surcharge on the cost of water in a drought year. And here is a graphic example of that. In the non-drought year, the total bill is $163.68. In a drought year, you would charge this drought surcharge on the use portion only. It does not apply to the base charge. The customer would pay an extra $6.50 in that month for a drought surcharge. So the bill would increase to $170.18.
And this doesn't seem like it would put any undue burden on staff. 6% is pretty easy, just up you go. There's no complicated extra overhead that we talked about with the other surcharge?
Well, I'll just clarify. So the rate would be set. If it was a drought year, it's, just throw a number, it's $5 per 100 cubic feet. If it's a non-drought year, it's 6% lower, whatever.
So not a lot of administrative effort.
I guess I'll let April answer that.
There would be some administrative changes because we would have to update the Springbrook system, which is our financial software. We would have to update the financial software system for each type of use. So not for each customer, but for each type of use, we'd have to update it in the system. Once the drought regulations have expired or have gone away, we would have to manually go in and take that all out. So every change that is done to the system as far as the rates that are charged, either the base rates or consumption, it is our staff manually going in, putting the new rates in. We'll have a second verification and a third verification just to ensure that the rates are put in there correctly. So for finance staff, yes, it will take some extra time, but that currently how the system is, we do the same thing now whenever we update the rates every year.
April, do you think that 6% adequately captures all the extra costs for drought years from your?
I have not crunched the numbers on it. It really is dependent on how many different factors we have to change, how many different types of rate structures there are. I wouldn't even feel comfortable giving an answer to that without actually crunching the numbers.
But I think the difference between the surcharge we talked about for Meadowood and this is the Meadowood required monthly, daily. Staff was talking about having to go out and check things and do daily. This is a one-time. It has an intensive moment where staff has to go in and make these changes, but we already do it for the CPI anyway, so there's been an annual update. So it's sort of this intensive work, and then it stays the same until that surcharge would be lifted. So it's a little bit different. One is administrative, the other is much heavier, boots on the ground. The guys out there having to do physical checks and tracking some of the information that they're seeing. So that's the difference. So I think even though very respectful of finance, this one has significantly less impact than the Meadowood surcharge.
So we've already saved the staff empty man hours in the other one, so we can give back a little bit here. Yeah. So I've got no questions. I'm ready to vote.
What would the additional revenue for a drought year for the water enterprise be with this 6% increase? The total number.
Usage.
It was.
I don't.
You had
Don't
it
have
per
that.
unit.
Don't have that number.
We-
I can calculate that now. I can
Okay,
come
we
back
bring in
with
$3
that.
million a year, so it would 10% would be 300,000. Half of that would be 150, so it'd be like 160,000 a year.
180.
180.
It's
Sure.
only on the use charge. Not
Oh, and it's only on the use charge, so it'd be even less.
So take 70% of that.
So you take 70% of that. So 70% of one.
70% of 180? 60,000? Yeah.
About $125,000.
Okay, it's real money, but it's not life-changing. Okay. So I think we're probably all in agreement that a reasonable drought charge is a good idea?
Yes,
To
absolutely.
capture costs?
Yes.
Onward.
Okay. The preferred rate structure. To recap, all rates must be based on the actual cost of providing water. Rates cannot be artificially inflated to discourage water use. Tiered rates are not compatible with St. Helena's water supply and use. We discussed that. The cost to provide water in the summer months is higher than the winter months, which supports a seasonal use charge. Seasonal rates can help to increase water conservation awareness. Per California Constitution, Article 10, Section 2, it requires the water resources of the state to be put to beneficial use to the fullest extent they are capable, and that the waste or unreasonable use or unreasonable method of use of water be prevented. So we did develop a seasonal rate structure for your consideration. Okay. The consensus at the last meeting was to do a seasonal rate structure, but you wanted to see the difference and the impact that that would have. Okay. This illustrates the impact. And what we did here was we did do a winter month and we did do a summer month. Again, we're just using the rates that would be adopted in November of 2017, regardless of which month we're looking at here. I think the big difference that we're showing here really is that if you have a seasonal rate structure, a customer would pay a little bit more in the summertime than they would under the uniform rate structure. In the wintertime, they would pay a little bit less. They're not vast differences. If you look at the summer month usage, the bill is about less than that, less than a $5 impact increase by having a seasonal structure. And in the wintertime, it's about $3 less to have a seasonal rate structure.
Does it gain us any 12-month revenue?
No change to your revenue. Again, this is just how you collect the revenue. The revenue requirement is the same, regardless. It's just, do you want to be collecting a little bit more in the summertime because that's when your costs go up? So these
it's more
seasonal.
of a cash flow.
It's more of a cash flow issue and also just a price signaling issue. You want people to understand the value of the service that they're receiving.
Yeah, and water conservation, as Catherine has said, higher rates don't necessarily discourage a lot of conservation, but it raises awareness and it makes people become more mindful. And right there, I feel like, personally, coming from water conservation, the more people think about how much water they're using, the better.
I support this.
Chuck?
I assume, again, administratively, it's the same thing. You've got to go in and update. I say yes. I agree awareness is important.
For that reason, I do too.
Okay, thank you. All right, should we do the review?
Sure. Okay, so I have for Meadowwood is to integrate the pumping surcharges into the entire system and to treat the system as a whole. As far as splitting the functional cost allocation, there was still a lot of questions, and it seems like we need to create clearer slides identifying what the cost to different users would be more clearly, but ultimately that this item would rest on City Council. And then for the residential base rate, 5/8 inch meters and 1 inch meters would pay the same base rate. And yes to the drought surcharge, and yes to seasonal charges. Did I
And
capture?
I think there was some consensus, although not numerical, that under functional cost allocation, we all thought the base rate should go up, right? Well, not talking about how quickly or even to what I'd like to see it eventually get to 70-30, but that might take 100 years.
But we were all agreeing to the incremental, at least the middle, the incremental increase, right, 1%.
Well, I don't know. Again, I got stuck at use cases. I needed to see the impact on different use cases to make that. Again, it's not really shifting revenue. All it's doing is protecting us.
Right.
So we're not losing any money going either way. To me, my concern would be on low-income folks and the impact, and I have no ability to. So I'm not leaning anyway. I'm suggesting that we maybe provide those use cases when it comes before council, so they can better assess, granting and what's coming into their water bill versus, Joe Montana.
Thank you.
So I guess we didn't have the consensus.
And I want to say thank you, because this is exactly the reason why we wanted the task force to meet, so we can talk through some of this stuff. And I think we have wastewater to do, and I know we're getting close on time, so we'll see how quickly we can.
Yeah.
Shall we agree now whether there's a certain amount of time past 3 o'clock that we would agree to go? An extra 15 minutes perhaps, or?
Yeah.
Is that all right with you? All right, so we can go to 3:15 if we need to.
Okay. Okay. Well, let's review first of all how the rates are currently set, how people pay their bills. So residential customers, all single-family customers pay the same base rate per dwelling unit, and then they pay a flow charge based on their winter average monthly use. So it's the average of their use in January, February, and March combined, divided by 3, that's the average monthly use in the wintertime. Then that amount gets applied to their account for every month of the year. Non-residential is just all other account types, including multifamily. They're all charged a base rate according to their meter size and their customer classification. And then they are charged a flow rate based on the amount of water that goes through the meter. And there's different customer classifications based on their flow and strength of wastewater. So non-residential is quite a bit more complicated with this structure. Okay. The current rate structure that you have, I feel quite strongly that there's not a good nexus to support having the non-residential customers paying any of their charges based on their meter size. The difficulty with wastewater is always that you cannot exactly measure how much they're using the system, because we don't have meters on every single, on the back side of the house. We don't know exactly how much flow is going from every single customer. I did make the comment last time that I don't think that your current rate structure is necessarily in jeopardy. I think it would pass Prop 218. It's still based on a customer's ability to use the water that may pass through to the wastewater system, but there's not a really clear nexus there. And we want to really have people pay as much as possible according to their flow and to the strength of the wastewater that they send to the treatment plant. So we presented 2 different options to you in August. The first option was that you kept the current rate structure. We just had one slight difference, and that was that religious places and community centers would be broken out as their own rate category because of their flow and their strength of their wastewater. Really felt like that was one customer that would need to change in category. But the rate structure that we presented and that we heard a consensus on that you would prefer is a new rate structure And this rate structure is now based all on flow and strength. It eliminates having any part of the non-residential bill be based on a meter size. It also classifies mobile home parks as residential. And that's because, again, their flow and their strength characteristics are far more similar to a residential customer than they are to a non-residential customer. So we're trying to capture people's use as best we can. Okay, the other change, no, sorry, it's not a change, but schools are charged based on the number of students, and now you would eliminate the meter charge, but each non-residential customer would pay a flat base rate based on the type of customer they are. That's a per account amount plus a use charge or flow charge based on their average winter water use, just like they are today. Okay, so we heard very strongly that you want to move to the new rate structure. So what we're going to do is just present the draft results to you today of that rate structure. Here is a single family bill. They use on average 700 cubic feet in the wintertime months. So currently they pay $75 a month, assuming that they're using 700 cubic feet. And in February, that would increase to $81. In November, that would increase to $99, and so forth, as you see through the graph.
Is that based upon moving to option 2?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
All of these that you see now are based on option 2.
Any comment on that chart, Chuck? Wayne?
Here are some rate impacts for some large water users. We have the St. Helena School District, a winery, and a mobile home park. So it's not necessarily the case that every customer's bill goes up. And of course, it depends on their winter average water use for that prior year. So these numbers are not going to be exact numbers. So the school district, actually, their bill would decrease. The wineries decreases slightly. The mobile home parks increases significantly. Again, that is for the entire mobile home park. So I don't know how they would divide it amongst each of their customers, but that bill amount would be divided amongst, or in some fashion, amongst their users.
What do you think accounts for the switch when you get to the mobile home park?
Because they are being treated as residential customers instead of non-residential customers.
Category. Thank you.
Do I recall you stating as well earlier that Proposition 218 did not allow cities to subsidize?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments?
Yes, actually, is there precedent for mobile home parks generally being considered non-residential?
Not that I know of, no.
Okay, so it doesn't make sense to me.
I don't know
either.
why it was categorized as non-residential.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
And here are some other, again, these are examples. We pulled accounts. We can't tell you which ones. We just looked at what would the impact be on each of these different various accounts, current monthly rates and the newly calculated rates. So you can see that the impact on customers can be very different. The restaurant increases significantly from $237 a month to over about $1,000. The motel without food increases, but not nearly to the same extent as for a restaurant. The religious place and community centers would decrease a little. The office decreases, the car wash increases. It's really based on what their flow was, and then they were categorized according also to the strength of their wastewater.
And with restaurant, you're averaging it out. You might have a place like a little sandwich shop next to Villa Corona. I forget the name of that place. That little versus Goose and Gander. I mean, obviously the sandwich shop wouldn't be an $800 a month increase, but Goose and Gander might be more than that. So that's the average restaurant.
No, we just pulled a restaurant, and I don't know which one it is. But the point that I think you're also illustrating is that this could be very different for different restaurants. So don't think that all restaurants are going to go from $237 a month to $1,000 a month. That's not the case.
Like a very small restaurant with one bathroom probably wouldn't have much change at all, or negligible, or small kitchen.
It would be a smaller change at least.
Yeah.
So we're just trying to show that different customers will have different impacts. It's very hard. You can't really put a percentage increase like you can on the residential side, roughly, because most residences use about the same amount. But for your non-residentials, you can't do that.
What is the methodology for the measuring the strength of the wastewater? I'm on septic myself, so I haven't done it. What, how's that done?
Again, it's just industry standards, guidelines. The State Water Resources Control Board provides those guidelines. And what I've done in my firm is we've done a database we have the State Water Resources Control Board numbers, and then we have a whole database of strength factors that we used in other rate studies from other engineers. And then that's what we use to determine what the strength is for.
So it's based on the number of people in the household and other factors, or?
No, it's more to do with what they're putting into the water by the time it gets into the wastewater plant. So are they adding a lot of chemicals, greases? So it's a biological oxygen demand and total suspended solids are the two parameters that are used.
Which is a big challenge in wineries, as I remember.
Yeah. Correct.
Okay, I get it. Thanks.
Okay. Well, that was wastewater. So do you have any comments on the wastewater?
Nope, I stand by my previous feelings.
Do we want to summarize our advice to the staff and the city council?
Yes. So, speaking for myself, I would actually be inclined to support my earlier opinion, which is that I'm in favor of that rate change. I think that I wish there weren't these exponential differences, certainly for the mobile home people, but I really do think that it makes sense that they are categorized as residential. I think that to underscore what my friend Mr. Vondra said is that in terms of the restaurant differential, certainly a small place with sort of less complicated preparation will have less of an impact. So I would say generally that it's important, again, that we do the best we can in terms of capturing costs, so I would support the increase.
And Catherine, you're confident that this proposal more accurately
Yes.
follows the burden of the wastewater?
Yes.
All right.
Well, plus, it's consistent if we're changing the water, not doing pipe size. It'd be inconsistent if we did it on the other side. So, and if it more fairly depicts true usage and cost, I think it's hard to argue against it.
All right, so with the provisos offered, I think we're all in favor of going forward with this part of the recommendations.
Yep.
Okay. In that case, what we wanted to also show you was the combined utilities impact, and this is where we look at comparisons with other areas. So here we have a graph showing how much a single-family home with a 5/8 inch meter, how much they would pay. I think this was for, I don't know how many hundreds of cubic feet this was for. Should have put that on there. I can't remember what the number is, but I can tell you the same number was used for every single comparison. So for the same amount of water used in a month, Napa would pay $107 that month. St. Helena, under the current rate schedules, would pay $151. And under the new rate schedules, would pay $187 a month. And then you've got Healdsburg, which is be the very high end of the scale, would be paying $240 a month. Again, bear in mind that $187 a month is based on our assumptions of the different options. So, for example, I can tell you we had continued the Meadowood surcharge, and now we'll be removing that. So that number will change by the time it goes to council. But just to give you an idea of where St. Helena's rates currently are in comparison with other places in the region and where it would go to, it would be, you're currently in the low mid-range, and you would move up to the high mid-range. I want to point out these are always a snapshot in time, that places are always, again, that's that 3 to 5 year review. Places are updating their rates usually about every 5 years. So where you are in that on that range will change.
And Catherine, if I recall correctly, I think this is 1,100 cubic feet.
I think Rachel used the average. I think you're correct. I think you're right. It's not on there.
That's my memory.
It should be on there. I think it is 1,100 cubic feet too. We'll make sure that's on there for the council presentation. Okay, and then we wanted to show you some of the combined impacts. Looking at the school district, recall that their sewer bill went down a little bit, but their water bill goes up, so they would end up at about the same. There's an example of a winery. Theirs actually goes down a little bit. And then there's the mobile home park, where you can see water goes up, but the wastewater goes up significantly. So they would go from paying about $20,000 to about $29,000.
Hey, Catherine,
yes.
I think there was one slide in between the rate comparison for the new rates.
The 1 inch?
Yeah.
Can you go
I
back
hit it.
one?
If we made that the same,
Oh.
these two would be squished together, and we'd have the average of
Yeah,
these two
okay.
graphs.
Correct.
I don't think we need to.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. So that's really the conclusion of my presentation.
Thank you, Catherine, for all the work and for your thoughtful presentation.
And
I was hoping that our Vineyard Valley guests would have their 3 minutes or their 6 minutes,
before
but
their chance. So
yeah, because they obviously had the highest obvious impact here. But I think we've been working on logic and trying to capture costs and attach fees to the people who are charging the burden to the system. So I think we've made progress.
Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge, because this is being recorded, that we could open it up for public forum, but there is no one in the audience today to speak. Anyone that was here has left before the public forum has opened. So I just want to note that.
Well, why don't we just open it so we can say that we did. We'll open the public forum now. Is there anyone who would like to comment on the subject of the meeting? Seeing no one coming to the microphone, we'll close the public comment. And we'll adjourn. We'll adjourn. Thank you, everyone.
all right.
Thank you.
Good.